Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Bilingual Brain Part 2. I'm your host, Inigo Lopez, and I'm pleased to be here with you. Today, the brain we really need to have is the brain of our VIP guest speaker, Professor Panos Athanasopoulos. Hi, Professor. Are you ready to share with us our brain?
Absolutely, yes. We're going to look at some brains today.
Okay, great. Thank you for being here. Just as a reminder, this session will be recorded. And in April last year, we had our first session of the Bilingual Brain with Professor Panos. It was about bilingualism and the benefits of speaking a second language. As the Bilingual Brain topic was really successful, now we bring part 2 with the title, Does Learning a New Language Rewire Your Brain? This event has been organized by the Paradigm Community, which is a non-profit organization to connect with other global business-minded people in a genuine, meaningful way that helps us grow professionally while giving back to diverse communities and having a bit of fun along the way. We are over 100 members at the moment. Without any further delay, let me formally introduce Professor Panos. He's a professor of applied linguistics at the Lancaster University. He works in the areas of experimental psycholinguistics, experimental cognitive linguistics, bilingual cognition, linguistic and cultural relativity. Panos, all yours. Thank you once again for your time today.
Thank you very much, Inigo, and thank you everyone for attending the talk today. It's always great, of course, apart from being a great honor to be invited to talk to people about your research. It's especially a pleasure to be talking to people who are not necessarily my peers or my colleagues. This is what we were talking about with Inigo earlier on. So yeah, so here, you know, it's almost a true test of some of the findings that we get from our laboratories to see how they translate for the public and for practitioners and for learners as well, because at the end of the day, we're talking about bilingualism and language learning, and this concerns all of us who are present here. So I'm going to be looking today at the bilingual brain. I'm going to be focusing on specific case studies at looking at the bilingual brain. As I am talking, if anyone has a question, feel free to pop it in the chat function, or just simply unmute your microphone and just say, hey, Panos, or Professor Panos, as Inigo calls me, please, you know, I have a question. So feel free to stop me at any point, but I will also try and leave some time for questions at the end if you would like me to go over something again, or if you have a particular query about some of the findings I will be showing you today, I'll be glad to expand. And of course, you can always contact me via email. The details are here on the first slide, and I will share that with you again at the end. So the topic is the bilingual brain part 2. I forgot to put part 2 on my slide, but what I did, I think it was a last minute addition, was to put this subtitle, Does Learning a New Language Rewire Your Brain? And I was inspired to put this in, not only because, of course, the topic is the bilingual brain, and we're going to be talking about the bilingual brain today, but because of a movie. I'm a movie buff. I have to warn you here. I'll be talking about movies. I like to talk about movies in my talks. And this particular one is a movie that has as its main theme language and its connection to reality and the world. So the movie buffs among you may have already recognized where this image comes from. It's always a test with my students. Who wants to get a good grade? Tell me, where does this image come from? Which movie? And the answer is the movie Arrival. Okay, so this is a Hollywood movie that came out, I think 2016 or something. And the main character is a linguist, you know, who works on languages and language learning. It's exciting already, right? I mean, Hollywood cares about language so much. Wow, excellent, great. And I wanted to watch it for some time. It was on my list of things to do at the time. And I just never got the chance until my brother called me and he said, oh, Panos, you'll meet my brother later on. He's in one of my slides. But he told me, "Oh, Panos, you should really watch this movie Arrival, because it's all about your research. You know, they are talking about things that you do in your laboratory." I said, "Really? What, Hollywood? Oh my God! I hope they haven't, you know, misrepresented anything, and they haven't made the research look in a bad light." And then I looked at, of course, I watched the film with a keen interest. And I realized that not only hadn't they hadn't misrepresented the research, but they did a really good job for Hollywood standards of actually accurately representing the theory behind the research. And the movies, for those of you that I don't want to, it's one of those movies where there's a big reveal at the end. So I'll try not to give you a spoiler here, not to ruin it for you if you haven't seen it yet. But the main topic is that this linguist played by Amy Adams, she's called to decipher this alien language, because guess what? Aliens have visited the Earth. They always do that in Hollywood movies, right? They come and visit, they go to America, of course. They visit the Earth, and she has to communicate with them somehow. And they have this peculiar way of communicating with lines. They draw circles, you know. And she's trying to decipher these circles. And as she does so, she learns the alien language. And as she learns the alien language, her own perception of the world changes. It changes the way she experiences the passage of time. Okay, so there is this brief dialogue in the movie. I'm coming back to the subtitle now of the talk about rewiring the brain, where Amy Adams, who's the linguist, is talking about the aliens language with Jeremy Renner's character, who plays a real scientist, not a linguist. So he plays a scientist in the movie, and they talk about the alien language. And Jeremy Renner's character says, "I was doing some reading that if you immerse yourself into a foreign language, you can actually rewire your brain." And then Amy Adams comes back and says, "Yeah, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the theory that the language you speak determines how you think." And this is a real hypothesis. This is an actual, you know, hypothesis that is being investigated not just in linguistics, but also in psychology, in anthropology, in neuroscience nowadays, in many different diverse disciplines. And so I was intrigued, you know, by that you know, Hollywood got it so right, because this is exactly the topic that we're investigating. How when you immerse yourself into a foreign language, you can actually rewire your brain. But how does that happen? And this is what I'm going to be touching on today in this talk. So I'm going to be looking at. I'm going to be looking at two different case studies. I'm going to be, first of all, focusing on vision, on how language may change the way that we actually look at things and notice things in our surroundings. I'll be using color and object perception as my examples. Then I will be talking about decision making, and I'll be talking about the connection between language and emotion, and how that may affect the way that we make judgment based on either moral values or utilitarian judgments. And all the data will come from bilinguals, because this is what we want to find out, whether bilinguals actually view the world in a different way from monolinguals. So I'm going to start with discussing effects on vision and focusing on color and object perception. And in fact, I'm going to take a step back, and let's drop the word second from our subtitle and just ask the very fundamental question: does learning a language, any language, our first language, rewire our brain? What does language do to our brain? Let's do a simple experiment now with you. If you can be my willing participants. I'm not going to pick out on a particular person. Feel free to just respond when you like, either by unmuting your microphone or by typing into the chat function. So I'm going to show you an image. It is, I just want you to focus on the image and tell me the first word that comes to your mind. If I was to show you this image and I was to ask you, what can you see? What would you tell me? Now, some of you may have seen the image before, so maybe you know the trick. It's a trick. Of course, all experiments are tricks. So you know the trick. So please, if you know the trick, do not reveal it. You know, let your colleagues, let the other people try and figure it out for themselves. But okay, let's look at the fundamental things now. So the simple question here is, what do you see? Quick, anyone? What's this? Yeah, I can see the chat. Brick, wall, stone, bricks. Perfect. Yes. Okay. Great. Our vision is 2020. It's intact. Of course. We are seeing bricks and a wall and a stone. Now here comes the second question. Can you see the cigar? Yes, haha, nope. No way. Yes, because you didn't see it before, I know. Right, some people have observed the stone. So the stone that you can see is actually the ash tip of the cigar. So if you focus on what appears as a stone, it's actually the ash tip of the cigar, and then on the right of that is the body of the cigar. Is it easier to perceive now, to see? Yes, can see it now, but didn't before. Yes, perfect. These are the responses that we normally get. Some really good responses in the chat as well. Normally, when I do it in a live room in person, there's this big aha moment from the audience. Oh, now I can see. Oh, wow, now I can see the cigar. If you still cannot see the cigar, don't worry. It says nothing about your perceptual skills. But the point is that for those of you that came to see the cigar after you heard the word, this was rewiring happening. We just rewired our brains, right? You know, because before you could see a wall and you could see bricks and a stone and all that, but your brain hadn't yet processed a key feature of this image that is actually right in front of your eyes. It's central. The cigar is central. You can't miss it when you know it's there. But you hear the word, and it's like throwing a pebble into a pond. And that pebble creates ripples, and all of a sudden, the word conjures up the image of the cigar. And now you can see the cigar. And what's really interesting is that the rewiring is permanent. From now on, when you see this image in the future, you will never be able to unsee the cigar. It will always be there. Okay, so already, we can get a sense of what words can do for our vision, for our perception. They bring it's not that, our vision was deficient before. We could, of course, see what was there, but our attention hadn't been tuned to the particular feature that is central in this screen. And this is more or less how many experiments, I'm just giving you the blueprint for any laboratory experiment on language and perception. That's what we're trying to find out in the lab. The cigar moment, we show people stimuli and we're trying to see how the brain actually perceives them. So here I'm going to show you some experiments now. I'm going to begin with color. And what we'll manipulate here when we look at these language perception interactions is the fact of linguistic diversity, how much diversity there is out there in the terms that languages employ when they describe the same reality. The fact is we all inhabit the same reality, the same world, but there are fundamental differences in how different languages cut up that reality to make sense of it. So just to show you a few examples from color, we take for granted, especially in Western societies, things like white and purple and orange and blue and so on. But there are languages with only two terms, a dark and a light term. And in fact, color in those languages like Dani of West Papua, color is not so much a visual thing as a sensation. So typically the dark colors, black, blue, and green, are called cold colors. So the word mili means cold, and the word mola means warm. And the lighter colors, white, red, orange, yellow, and pink and purple, are called warm colors. So it's more of a sensation than an actual visual thing. Then other languages have three terms, apart from a dark and a light term. They also have a red term, and within that we have purple and orange and things like that. In fact, the majority of the world's languages have a GRU term. This is what we linguists call GRU, a term that denotes both green and blue. And you find this nowadays, for example, among the Himba in Namibia, the Berino in Papua New Guinea. I've got the atlas there with the different locations, just to also show you the geographical diversity, just to appreciate, how apart these languages are, yet they have these common linguistic features. And of course, historically, other languages had this GRU term, like Chinese and Japanese, and Welsh, the famous observation that the traffic lights in Tokyo are not quite green, but kind of bluish green or blue. It alludes to this GRU term. And closer to home, to my home, because I'm a Greek native speaker, we also distinguish on a basic level between two different shades of blue, a light blue shade called galasio and a dark blue shade called ble. And the same distinction can be found in Russian, Turkish, and also Italian, Spanish, and Japanese. So to me, this distinction between light and dark blue is as fundamental as a distinction between green and blue, for example. So I would call the sky, in English, I would call the sky blue, but I would never call the sky ble in Greek. I would have to use galasio, because it's a different type of blue that refers to the sky. Okay, so the first thing that we wanted to ask as researchers here is, what do we actually mean when we talk about the colors, when we talk about these things in our everyday life? So there's a lot of individual variation anyway when it comes to color. Just ask my wife, and then take me. I'm completely blind to some of the distinctions that she can see. But we try to make sense of them and systematize them in some way. And this is one of the tasks that we do. We show our participants an array of colors. It could be the full array with all the colors on there. Here I'm just showing you the blue array because I mentioned the Greek blue. And we try, one of the things that we try to get a sense of is how people hold prototypical representations of these colors in their mind. So prototypes, we say, show me your best blue, and they point to a particular color square that is their best blue. And you're going to find a lot of individual variation. Again, yes, as a function of gender and age group, as somebody mentions in the chat, also as a function of expertise. Again, get a painter decorator. He'll come in with a Dulux chart, and you're lost. You're like, what? What do I want I just want my kitchen to be blue. I don't know about all these other colors, that you're showing me here. So it's a question of expertise, and language is one aspect of experience that can bring about such expertise. So if you have another term that cuts up the blue domain, doesn't mean that you perceive finer distinctions in this particular space of the color spectrum. So here, in this experiment, we asked participants to show me their best blues. So we asked Greek monolinguals to show us the prototypes of their native terms, so the dark blue term ble and the light blue term galasio. And we asked English English monolinguals as well to show us the blue prototype. So for English monolinguals, typically is a key word here. Typically, people will choose the square that I've put the white circle on. If they don't choose that one, they will definitely choose one of the adjacent squares, right? So they cluster into a particular area of color space. And for Greek speakers, for the native terms, they will choose something different. So for the dark term, it's darker than the blue term on the bottom right, and also a little bit towards the purple side of the spectrum. And for the lighter term, it's much lighter than blue. And it's also kind of more towards the green end of the spectrum. So already we have this variation between monolingual speakers of different languages. When we ask the same question to bilingual speakers, so in this particular task, we asked the bilingual speakers about the native color terms, and they had a fundamentally different idea of what they meant. They were aware that, of course, Blaze is dark blue and Galazio is light blue, but what they meant by them was something different from what their monolingual peers meant. So we see that the dark blue term now is completely the same. It maps onto the English blue term. So there's a direct effect of the second language word onto the first language word. But even the light blue term, even though it's still, they distinguish it in lightness. So you can see in the vertical dimension, they're making a distinction there, right? They're choosing a really light example for the light blue term. But if you look at the horizontal dimension, the hue, it's shifting towards the English prototype, actually, away from the greens, which was the Greek monolingual prototype, towards the center, which is the English prototype. So we see this semantic reorganization in meaning in our bilinguals. So the next step here is to actually address the more fundamental question. So if people mean different things by using these color terms, does it mean that they actually detect them differently as well? Does it mean that the brain has changed in some way? I told you in the beginning that you'll meet my brother. So this is my brother, George. He's taking part in one of our experiments in our electrophysiology laboratory. And we use electrophysiology to measure electrical activity in the brain. We place these electrodes on the participant's scalp, and essentially they tell us how much effort the brain is putting when we show or display stimuli on the screen. And from that, we can deduce how things are represented in the human brain. It's a really good technique because it allows us to detect this electrical activity in the brain millisecond by millisecond. And just to show you how important that is, how fundamental it is for how humans process things in general, right? So the brain is made up of billions of neurons, like connections, you know, and anything that we do or say is a result of this electrical activation of these neurons. So these are kind of the physical correlates, if you like, of any kind of cognitive activity, any thinking that we do. This kind of, I talk about electrical activity. You have to, of course, understand that this is minimal in terms of voltage. So we're not going to get electrocuted. Nobody's getting electrocuted, right, by having these things on the brain, because the voltage is extremely low. But we can look at how the brain is activated. So let's try to activate our brains here with a simple task. This is what my brother had to do in the laboratory. So I'm going to show you, you can see on your screen now, a large square, which is, you can imagine this is our computer screen, when I'll be showing you stimuli. And you'll see lots of stimuli, and I would urge you to pay attention because they're going to be flashing very quickly on the screen. I want you to respond when you see a square. Typically, we ask participants in the laboratory to press the space bar on the computer keypads to just indicate that they've seen the square. Here, I will just ask you to just raise your right hand whenever you see a square. Okay, so you'll see other shapes too. Ignore, just focus on the square when you see a square. Okay, ready, steady, go. Perfect. Thank you all very much for being so observant. You were really, really good. Yes, you're really, really good at observing the square. And of course, you know, this is what we expect to happen. You know, if you don't observe the square, it means that either you're not paying attention or you have some kind of visual impairment. But you will have noticed as well that there was another difference, another visual difference in the stimuli, which was the luminance, right? So sometimes you had things that appeared in dark blue instead of light blue. And this is what we focus on when we measure brain activity in this task. It's almost a task that aims to mislead the participants on purpose, because the interest is not what happens when you see the square. The interest is what happens when you see the change in luminance. So you see a lot of light blue circles that flash on the screen, and every so often you see a dark blue circle, what we call a deviant. Okay, I didn't ask you to pay attention to the dark blue circle. All I asked you to do was to tell me when you see a square. Okay, so this is a trick here. You know, we want to analyze brain activity for this deviant when the brain is not expecting a change, right? And so we find that the brain actually reacts to these differences without warning as early as 180 milliseconds. And 180 milliseconds is less than 1/5 of a second. It's rapid. It's outside of your control, of your conscious control. You know, you cannot really do anything about it. Your brain is doing all the working for you. So here, in a typical experiment like this, we try to control for all the possibilities, right? We have lots of light blue, which we call standards because they flash all the time. So we habituate the brain to these standards, light blue standards and a dark blue deviant. But then in another block, we might have dark blue standards and a light blue deviant. And we also have green here as a control color. And that's very, very important if we want to show that the effects are because of language and not because of the environment. Because when I started doing this particular research about 12, 13 years ago, one of the criticisms that I got from reviewers was, well, of course, you're testing Greeks, and if you go to Greece, oh, the sun is shining and you have the sea and all the different shades of blue. And so the brain is already habituated without language doing anything. So we used green here as a control color because first of all, both Greek and English have one term for green, so no light or dark green terminology there. And secondly, arguably in the UK, there are more shades of green than in Greece, or at least in most parts of Greece. So if it was really an effect of environment, we would see it in the greens for the English speakers, but not the Greek speakers. So let me show you some brain waves here from this task. So what we measure here are two things. The most important thing that we measure is time, how quick things happen in the brain. And that's represented by the horizontal axis here. And we measure it in milliseconds because things in the brain happen extremely fast. So we go from 0 to 1,000 milliseconds. So 1 second is an eternity for the brain. Right? A lot of things can happen in 1 second. And we focus on a very, very specific time window that is, this is represented by the gray bar here, that is around 200 milliseconds, so 1/5 of a second. This is when the brain starts perceiving these visual distinctions. The other thing that we measure is amplitude, which is represented by the vertical axis here. We measure it in microvolts because, as I said, the electrical activity is minuscule, but still it is there, and we can see diversions from what is going on. So essentially what we're trying to do here, or what we're going to see, is how the brain reacts when it sees a deviant color. So this circle that is a dark blue circle, for example, when it had already been seeing a lot of light blue circles, and the same for the green. So how does the brain react when it sees a dark green circle when it has been habituated with light green circles? Let's start with the greens. These are English native speakers, and we see this is the brainwave for the standard. So this constant hammering of these light green circles, and then this is what happens when this is a deviant circle, a jump in electrical activity, right? You see that the brain has registered that, oh, something happened there, a visual change. And we get the same for the blues. So this is what happens when the brain habituates these blue standards, and then there comes the deviant blue. And again, there's a jump in electrical activity. The important point here is that for the English natives, the two jumps are identical. whether they see dark green versus light green or dark blue versus light blue, the brain will react in the same way. Now, this is what happens in Greek natives. So we have our brainwave for the standard greens and the brainwave for the deviant greens. So the brain has noticed the visual difference. And now this is what happens for the blues, standard blues versus deviant blues. And here we see a larger deflection of the brainwave, meaning that the Greek brain has paid more attention to the visual distinction between the two blues than between the two greens. And of course, then, okay, so these are native speakers and language has habituated them to pay different attention to these visual distinctions. But what about bilinguals? And then we studied Greek speakers that were students in the UK and they had lived in the UK for a long time. So just to remind you again, these are the brainwaves of the English monolinguals. So they pay equal attention to green and blue distinctions. These are bilinguals that have stayed in the UK, the native Greek speakers that have stayed in the UK between 3 and 6 months, and they make a distinction between the two blues that is far greater than that between the two greens. And in the middle here, we have our long stay bilinguals, bilinguals that have stayed in the UK for at least 2 years. And what we see is that they still make the distinction between the two blues, but it's simply shorter. It's less than that made by the short stay bilinguals. So it's like, I don't want to use the term attrition, but it's like they're in between the two monolinguals, right? In between the Greek monolinguals and in between the English monolinguals, the distinction is still there. It's just not as prominent as for the short stay bilinguals. So this is one way to, or a more elaborate way to go back to the cigar experiment, you know, how language rewires their brain. Long-term use of a language that doesn't make a distinction, a lexical distinction, between visual distinctions that you have in your native language can lead you to start paying less attention to that visual change. I'm really excited about this next study because this is what we're currently working on right now. So I'm going to show you some data that had not been seen before. So, you know, take this, you know, to your grave, or not, because of course this will be broadcast live. I mean, the recording will be available as well. But here are some preliminary findings. This is so cool, right? So with color, you have all these other things going on about, yes, visual, diet and environment and culture and whatever, you know. Then we turn our attention to objects, okay? With objects are really interesting and cool because, so color is a continuum, right? You know, it's not actually perfectly categorical, but objects are perfectly categorical. You can have, you know, pretty standard categories with objects. And even though they are standard categories and have a very definite function, you find really interesting cross-linguistic differences. So for English speakers, and this is something I wasn't aware of until I actually started working on this study. So for English speakers, the thing on the top left is a cup and the thing on the top right is a mug. I never understood this distinction, you know, why it's there, but it is. Cup and a mug are different things apparently. Whereas for the bottom objects, you can use the word glass. And it applies to both of them, right? Whether it's a tall glass for wine or a different one for water or whatever, it's just glass. Okay, but in Spanish, it works differently. And Indigo, you can feel free to correct me here. So the thing on the bottom left is called copper, and the thing on the bottom right is called vaso. So they're different terms for these things. The things at the top that were called cup and mug in English are called taza in Spanish, right? So we have the perfect cross-linguistic distinction here to test, you know, how the brain perceives these things. One distinction that exists in English but doesn't exist in Spanish, and one distinction that exists in Spanish but doesn't exist in English. So in our first experiment, we looked at our Spanish and English monolinguals. We gave them an almost identical task than the one that you saw for color earlier. So we showed them lots of objects flashing on the screen, and we told them to press a key whenever they see a ball So the ball here is our foil, is a trick, right? So we'd focus on the ball, but every so often there would be a deviant here. So stand as a deviant, that would be the cup, and the target would be the ball. Now, we're not interested in what is going on when they see the target, because we've told them about it. When you see a ball, press a key. What we're interested in seeing is what happens when they see the deviant, the cup that is interspersed among these different mugs that they are looking at. And again, if we look at, hopefully you'll be now more familiar with what we are seeing here. So we have on the horizontal axis time, again, measured in milliseconds. On the vertical axis, we have our amplitudes in terms of microvolts. And we are looking at the time window, again, very, very early. So again, around, even earlier than 200 milliseconds, in fact. And we see on the left-hand side for the Spanish speakers, when they see a cup, the brain doesn't really care, right? I mean, it's the brainwave, the deviant versus the standard is not really very large a difference. Whereas if you look at the right side, for English speakers, there is a huge jump in electrical activity. So when they see cup, the brain just notices more the visual distinction, because they have a different term for it, right? So in Spanish, it's all taza, whereas in English, it's cups and mugs. And I don't have the graph to show you here, but we found the same thing for the glasses. So for glasses, the reverse pattern. English speakers don't notice the different glasses, but Spanish speakers notice the difference between copa and vaso. Right now, we are testing bilinguals. So unfortunately, I don't have the data for the bilinguals, but what we've done here with the bilinguals is to try and vary the language context that they're operating in. So we're trying essentially to test the idea that if the bilingual is operating in different language contexts, they behave like a different person. So it goes back to the old proverb, learn a new language and get a new soul. So 2 languages, 2 minds. Are you a different person in your different languages? We do it in a very simple way. When they see these displays, every so often there will be a word in the language that we want to immerse them in. So a Spanish word or an English word, and we try to see whether they behave in a more Spanish way when they're in a Spanish context, and in a more English way when they're in the English context. So yeah, it's still going on. So hopefully I will have, next time I speak to this event, then I can show you that data, hopefully. Okay, so I've been talking about effects on vision so far. The main point being that indeed learning a new language has tangible effects. You can see the effects actually on the brain, how it rewires the neurons to perceive colors and objects differently. Now, in the second half of the talk, I'm going to focus on decision making. And again, I'm going to look at language context here as well. And I'm going to link language to that part of the brain that handles our emotions. It's called the limbic system, for those of you that want to know. So the limbic system regulates all our emotions. The limbic system is actually subcortical. It's like really deep inside our brain. It's very primitive. It's one of the first things that we evolved as humans. That's why it's so deeply embedded in our brain. The way that we use or not use the limbic system to make decisions may have effects on what kind of decisions that we take. So there are 2 ways to think about things. One way is the affective route, the emotional route. So this is what we call your gut instinct, your gut feeling. You take quick decisions here that tend to be unconscious and emotionally charged. The other way is the analytical route. It is more systematic, more time intensive, because you need to weigh up the options and see what route you're going to take. So it relies more on logic and utility. All things considered, what is the best option here? That's the analytical route. Affective route is, I don't want to think about it too much. I'm just going to go with my gut instinct. So it's this affective route that is linked to a limbic system in the brain. Now, if we look at how languages are connected to the emotional centers of the brain, we know already from other research that the first language is our more emotional language. So there are some of the most fascinating studies here look at electrodermal activity. So they stick, these electrodes I showed you before that go on the brain. So we can put also electrodes on the hand and measure sweat and see how much somebody is sweating when they see particular things on the screen. So if we show people swear words that everybody finds offensive, you know, if you see them in your first language, you sweat more than if you see them in your second language. Why? Because the first language is more intimately connected neurally to the limbic system in the brain. Whereas the second language, you learned it later in a classroom, you learn it in a more analytical way anyway. So it's not as emotional as your first language. Okay, so that's why, I mean, people have observed, I don't know, noticed it myself, but my wife, who is British, she says, oh my God, you swear so much in English. Would you do that in Greek? I said, probably not. No, I swear in English, maybe because it's my second language and I'm emotionally detached, you know, from it. But not so much in Greek, which is interesting. Now, if we look at these two different ways to make decisions, and then we map them on to how our languages are connected to the emotional centers of the brain, we can make the prediction that if we make decisions in our first language, they are going to be more emotional decisions. We'll rely more on our gut instinct when we use our first language. Whereas if we take the same decisions, the same dilemmas in our second language, we're going to make more logical decisions. We're going to be more utilitarian in our thinking. Let me just demonstrate quickly in one of the classic experiments in this area. So this is it. Imagine, this is the scenario. Imagine that you have the opportunity to save the lives of 5 people. But to do so, you must kill one person. Would you kill the one person, or would you do nothing and let the 5 people die? So here you have this conflict. You have a moral imperative, don't take a life. But you also have a utilitarian imperative, sacrifice a life to save 5. Okay, so what do you do? There's no right or wrong answer. I mean, sometimes it's good to go with a moral imperative. Sometimes it's good to go with the utilitarian imperative. Now, it gets even more interesting because there are 2 versions of this task. One is the footbridge version, which is the emotion intensive one. So here we tell the participants, oh, you are actually going to throw this person off the bridge yourself. There he is. You know, it's a large person. You're going to physically take them and throw them on the train track to save the 5 people. And then there is a less emotional version on the right, the switch version. Instead of doing it yourself, you have a switch and you will pull the switch, and the train will change direction and it will kill the one person instead of the 5 people. I mean, you're still killing somebody, but you don't do it physically. You don't throw them off the bridge yourself. So this is the kinds of findings that we get from this classic findings. So we have, So we have percentage of utilitarian choices here. The utilitarian choice is to kill the one person in order to save the 5 people. So if we look at the switch scenario on the left-hand side, which involves the person just pushing a lever to change the direction of the train, there is no difference between the native and the foreign language. The native language is the dark shaded bar, and the foreign language is the light shaded bar. So it doesn't matter which language you have a dilemma in. You will actually, 80% of people will actually pull the switch to kill one person, so that one person dies and 5 people are saved. In the more emotional dilemma, the footbridge dilemma, when you yourself have to push the person on the tracks, to begin with, we see that the utilitarian choices here are much lower on the right-hand side than on the left-hand side in general, right? People would hesitate more to push, physically push a person so that they fall to their death. But what we see, interestingly, is that this differs as a function of which language you make the decision. So in your native language, you tend to take the moral imperative a lot more than in your foreign language, where you tend to take the more utilitarian imperative. So in your foreign language, you're more likely to push the person on the tracks so that you can save the 5 people than in your native language. So we have a first demonstration of how this might work when it comes to making these judgments, it's life and death judgments. But we can also look at more real scenarios and biases that come in the language in our native language that we don't even realize are there. These unconscious biases will make decisions. And this will be my last demonstration here. So here's a dilemma for you. If you can be my willing participants, and this will be the last task of that day. But it's an important one and very close to our recent experiences with COVID, of course. We've just been through a pandemic. We're out of it now. And there was a lot of debate about how to cure people and what is going to happen and all that. So here's the dilemma. Recently, a dangerous new disease has been going around without medicine. So imagine now you have to make this decision, right? This is what we tell the participants. You are the Minister of Health. This is what your scientists are presenting you with. You have to make a decision here. So without medicine, 600,000 people will die from the disease. In order to save these people, two types of medicine are being made. If you choose medicine A, 200,000 people will be saved. If you choose medicine B, there's a 33% chance that 600,000 people will be saved, so everyone will be saved, but also a 66% chance that no one will be saved, and everybody will die. Which medicine do you choose, A or B? You can shout out or write in the chat. Already a few A responses in the chat. A, yes. Yes, A, because well, it's a sure option. At least you're going to save 200,000 people, right? Okay, good, thank you. So here comes the second dilemma. Same scenario. So recently, a dangerous new disease has been going around. Without medicine, 600,000 people will die from it. In order to save these people, two types of medicine are being made. If you choose medicine A, 400,000 people will die. If you choose medicine B, there's a 33% chance that no one will die, so everyone will be saved. And a 66% chance that 600,000 people will die. Which medicine do you go for now? I'm trying to look for a B. Nobody's going for B. Perfect. Yeah, everybody's going for A. Good. Right. Why? Because nothing has changed. It's the same dilemma, right? It's the way that is phrased that changes. So in the first scenario, we presented medicine A as a gain, right? We said, if you choose medicine A, 200,000 people will be saved. Okay. And when you present things as a gain to people, so you're going to save people, people tend to go for the sure option, medicine A. Medicine B is the risky option because you can save everybody, but you can also kill everybody, right? The second time that I showed this to you, medicine A was presented as a loss. So here, 400,000 people will actually die. So when people are presented with a potential loss, they actually prefer to go for the risky option for medicine B. The fact you didn't go for medicine B, you went for medicine A, is proof that when you do this in your second language, you're not fooled by this gain-loss framing. You're always going to go for the sure option. And this is, in fact, what research shows. So this is the data from the study that looked at Japanese. There were English native speakers, in fact, with Japanese as a second language. And they were tested in English and Japanese on this framing effects paradigm. They were asked to decide between a sure option and a risky option in two different framings, like we did here, gain versus loss. And what researchers found is that if people were presented with the dilemmas in their first language, which was English, so you see here the percentage of participants who select the sure option as a function of frame and language. So the dark bars, the black bars, are when it is presented as a gain, you're going to save 200,000 people, and the gray bars are when it's presented as a loss. 400,000 people will die. When people do this in the first language, they fall for it. They fall for it, even though that nothing changed. The scenario is exactly the same. People fall for this bias. They go for the gain framing more than when it's presented as a loss. If they do it in the second language, in Japanese, there is no difference. They know that, well, it's the same thing. You know, it's, you know, how you haven't told me anything different here. So that people tend not to fall for it. And these kinds of things, you know, translate into other types of decision making and risk assessments. Like there was this study, for example, that looked at people's fear of flying, and they gave the questionnaire to people in their first language and the second language. And they found that if you do this questionnaire in your first language, you actually are more afraid of flying than if you do it in your second language. So again, like it's as if your second language is setting you free from a bias that has to do with how emotional you are when you are flying. Another famous study has looked at gambling. So when we all gamble, of course, come on, everybody has gambled in their life. So when we gamble, sometimes if we keep winning, we think we're in a hot streak, right? We think that, oh, lady luck is favoring me, and we keep gambling, you know. Of course, that's nonsense. There's no lady luck. That's nonsense. There's no hot streak. It's all blind chance, probability. You know, that's what casinos make. How casinos make their money. They want you to keep playing because eventually you lose. So the studies have found that if you gamble in your first language, you're gonna fall for this hot streak effect. You will try to personalize luck and think that, oh, I'm being lucky now, so I'm gonna keep on playing. If you're gambling a second language, you're less likely to fall for this kind of bias and stop gambling earlier on. So if there's anything to take home today from this, is if you go to a casino, always gambling a second language. Don't do it in your native language because you might lose. Unless you're very rich, of course, and you like living dangerously. So I think this is what we can summarize the talk now. And basically, there are two main things that we saw from our case studies. The first one is learning a new language changes the way that the brain perceives visual distinctions. And then we looked at the connection between language and the emotional centers of the brain and how that affects decision-making differently, depending on which language we use to make our choices. And I think I have left a few minutes, 5 minutes at least, I think, Inigo, for any questions that you might have. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you, Panos. I have one question for you about what you mean by bilingual. Do you mean somebody who's born in a country of a different language than the parents, so that both languages are managed exactly on the same level? Or do you mean somebody as yourself who's moved into the UK and learned the second language and then he's bilingual on both?
Thank you, Nico. That is a hugely important question, not least because there is no immediate answer to it. It's actually, you will be surprised at, it's a huge point of debate in my field. Nobody actually has defined what bilingual is. So you can look at definitions based on time, when you learn the languages, and you can say, okay, if you learn the languages early in your life, you're bilingual, but if you learn the second language later, then you are a second language speaker, a second language user. But then it's tricky because, okay, what is the cutting line? At what age, you know, must you learn the language to not be classified as a bilingual? Other people go by proficiencies. You must be very advanced in the second language to be classed as bilingual. All these definitions come with their own problems, and especially in the way that they're used in these studies. So the way I use the term bilingual is a maximal one. Everybody's a bilingual. You're a bilingual, Inigo. I'm a bilingual. To me, it's about function. If anytime you use another language, de facto, you are a bilingual because you're using another language. Then within that, you can you can say, okay, now we want to look at early versus late bilinguals, or we want to look at more proficient versus less proficient bilinguals, or we want to look at bilinguals that use their second language more than the first language. So then you can try to make it a continuum instead of a hard and fast distinction between a true bilingual or a second language user. But that's the way I use the term. Other colleagues of mine would have my head. You know, they would say, no, you know, bilinguals, those that learn the language before 5 years old, they're bilinguals. And those that learn it after 5 years old, they are second language users. So really, there's no answer to it. This is why it's a big question. There's no immediate answer to this.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much. Is there anyone else with a question? No. Okay, great. So so then I think we wrap up. So I really want to thank you for your time today, and this is our Bilingual Brain second part. So I'm looking forward for the third part. We'll keep you updated, and yeah, once again, thank you very much for everything, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you very much, Inigo, and for everyone for your attention as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.